Good evening. Buenas noches. I'm Frankie Miranda, President and CEO of Hispanic Federation. And thank you for joining our virtual webinar, Redistricting 101, Engaging Latinos in the Process. I want to thank our co-host, Latino Justice ProDef, and the NALEO Educational Fund for helping us organize this event. And I also want to thank Dr. Ibelis Cuevas Molina, who represents the Latino community as a member of the Independent Redistricting Commission and who will be providing some remarks after the panel. Our event is being translated into Spanish live. Si usted quiere escuchar este evento traducido al español, tenemos las instrucciones de cómo acceder al canal de traducción en el chat. I would like to welcome you to this important discussion about the redistricting process, how it works in the state of New York, and how it affects our communities, and most importantly, how you can get involved. But first, let's take a step back. Redistricting is a process of creating the boundaries of each representational district within local, state, and federal jurisdictions. And it does not happen in a vacuum. If we want to talk about redistricting process, we must look at the census, specifically the 2020 census and its effects. After all, the population counts of the 2020 census will determine how many people are within those boundaries. And 2020 was a hectic year full of news. So some of you may not remember or may want to forget how unusual was and difficult this process of the census count. From trying to add the citizenship question or remove non-citizens from the count to start and stopping operations in the last week of the census. The Trump administration put up roadblock after roadblock to undercount our communities. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic made things worse, with enumerators as well as community organizations having to suspend the in-person operations at some point during the process. Facing all those hurdles, many of the organizations here work nonstop to ensure that as many people as possible were counted because we understood what was at stake. And despite our best efforts, the state of New York lost a congressional seat because 89 people were not counted. Let's take a pause and let that sink in. Because of 89 people, those that were not counted, New York lost a congressional seat. And I am confident that if all of us here attending this webinar go through their phone contacts, we can come up with probably more than 89 people that were not counted in the census, no matter what their reason was. The loss of a seat affects all of us here. At a time when we need resources the most, when we are still being devastated by the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects, our Black and Brown communities have less political representation at the federal level. The loss of a congressional seat is also a reminder of what is at stake with the redistricting process. These districts are drawn in the next few months or will dictate who represent us for the next 10 years. It will determine if you and your neighbor across the street can go to the same elected official to solve an issue in your neighborhood, or if you must call two different people in City Council or in Albany. The events of the last 2 years here and in other states have also shown us how decisions made by state and local officials can be the difference between life and death in our communities. Mask mandates, COVID testing sites, vaccination events, even determining how and when schools will reopen are some of the examples of how elected officials impact our daily lives. In recent months, we also have seen examples of how those elected officials can help expand voter rights or take them away. We have seen how they can support COVID-19 regulations that keep our communities safe or ignore science to the detriment of everyone. Understanding all the effects of redistricting is essential for our future as a community, as a city, and as a state. But not everyone knows about this process or how they can get involved in it. And that is why we're so proud to be here tonight, along with an incredible list of incredible panelists. Our goal is that by the end of this event, you will understand why this redistricting is important and what you and your organization can do to ensure that we have a fair and transparent process that involves the Latino community. So let's get started. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. First stop is Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez, who represents the New York 68th District in the New York State Assembly. He is the chair of the Legislative Task Force on Demographic Research and Reappointment. The task force is responsible for conducting research projects related to the collection and use of census data and other statistical information. Thank you for joining us, Assemblyman.
Thank you, Frankie. Thank you for having me.
Jennifer Wilson is the Deputy Director of the League of Women Voters of New York. The League of Women Voters works to increase understanding of major public policy issues and influences public policy through education and advocacy. In New York, the League of Women Voters had led joint advocacy letters to ensure that the Independent Redistricting Commission received the appropriate amount of funding to operate. Thank you for joining us, Jennifer.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Our next panelist is Jeffrey Wise. He is an adjunct professor at New York Law School and a senior fellow at the Census and Redistricting Institute. Mr. Wise is considered a national expert on redistricting and has over 40 years of experience working in redistricting, voting rights, and census law. Thank you for joining us, Jeffrey.
My pleasure.
Emily Paez from the Hispanic Federation is our Director of Civic Engagement and Government Affairs. Last year, Emily spearheaded our census operation that engaged more than 380 Latinos in New York to encourage them to get counted, and is now leading our efforts to get Latinos involved in redistricting. Gracias, Emily.
Thanks, Frankie.
And we have Fulvia Vargas de Leon. She is the Associate Counsel at the Latino Justice ProDev. For more than 40 years, Latino Justice ProDev has acted as an advocate against injustices throughout New York and beyond. Latino Justice uses litigation and advocacy to protect Latino voting rights by challenging vote denial practices. Fulvia, muchas gracias.
Hi, Frankie, happy to be here.
And now let's begin our discussion. And for that, Fulvia is going to get us started with a presentation on the basics of redistricting. Fulvia, take it away.
Share my screen. I hope you're all viewing the presentation at this time. Great. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Fulvia Vargas de Leon, and I'm an Associate Counsel for Latino Justice ProDev. As Frankie mentioned, our redistricting work spans over the last 4 decades. And as you may hear tonight, we are part of the Unity Mapping Coalition, along with the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College. The Unity Mapping Coalition is focused on creating maps which respect compactness, geographic contiguity, and communities of interest, and are created from the input of Latinos, Asian Americans, and Black residents in New York City. Tonight, I will provide you a very brief overview about the redistricting process in New York. So I participate in the census. What happens now? We often place much emphasis on the census, and it's truly important, as you'll learn today, and making sure everyone is counted. Yet very few people, including myself, before I took on this role, understood what happened after that data is collected. And this brings us to redistricting. So oftentimes when we speak about redistricting, you'll hear the terms reapportionment, you'll hear the terms redistricting used throughout the process. However, to start off, they are not the same. Reapportionment, which is the data we received in April from the census, is really about the redistribution of seats in Congress based on changes in the population. So as you heard Frankie mention, New York lost a congressional seat by a very small, by not having counted a very small fraction of the population, about 80 something seats. New York currently has 27 congressional districts. That means we have 27 US House of Representatives. But based on our population change, we will now have 26. There are a total of 435 seats in Congress. And so every 10 years, the census gets data about the total population of each state, the total population of the country, and then allocates seats to each state in relation to their portion of the population. Pretty straightforward, a simple math equation, we would say. But what we're talking about here is redistricting. And redistricting really is about the redrawing of congressional and legislative electoral districts. So that voting district that you belong to every 10 years to reflect shifts and changes in populations. So everyone here, you live in New York or you're listening from another place, another state, you're all part of an electoral district. And this is what we're talking about. Every 10 years, as a population shifts, as people change, they move, they're born, districts expand, they decrease. And so we have to redraw those lines to reflect the changes in the population. New York, aside from the 26 congressional district it will have, also has 63 state Senate districts and 150 state assembly districts. So how redistricting works. Let's say, and I apologize in advance for the cheesy graphics, but in 2010, as you see a map on the left, there was, let's say 25 people in the state of New York, and let's say there were 3 congressional districts. Easy, we would divide each district to reflect the change in the population, right? Between 2010 and 2020, let's say the population in New York grew by 5 additional residents. It's a lot more, but for the sake of the graphics, we kept it quite small. And now let's say the total population we have is 30 people. I want to preface that by saying, notice I said people. In redistricting, we include the total number of people. We do not exclude based on citizenship or age. Everyone is included when we're talking about redistricting. And so let's say a map then in 2020 would have to reflect that 5 additional residents were added in population. And so now we would have at least 3 districts that each have about 10 people included in each district. While I did not include it in this example, redistricting may also require us to move around some of the physical lines to start to better encompass the districts. And this is what we're talking about redistricting. It's allocating those individuals or those new additions to the population to electoral districts, or recreating or redrawing those electoral districts to reflect the changes that have occurred. Okay. So you ask yourself, okay, that seems pretty easy. What's the issue? There's this many districts, there's this many people in the state of New York, divide them, it's math. I'm not sure what the issue is here and why we're having this discussion. You can, the goal is always to have districts that are equal as possible in population. And so again, we're talking about just numbers and dividing districts accordingly. Not so fast. So here is the issue that happens in redistricting and why many, including Latino Justice, Hispanic Federation, NALEO, and others on this call advocate for or try to educate the community about redistricting. Historically, redistricting has been used to prevent minority voters from gaining political power by drawing districts in a way that results in these voters having less of a chance of electing candidates of their choice. You'll hear the term gerrymandering or gerrymandered districts, right? And so that means that when we talk about a district that is gerrymandered, we talk about a district that was somehow manipulated, or those lines were manipulated to influence the outcome of an election, to maybe keep incumbents in power, or hinder the ability for certain people and or groups from having the power to elect representatives of their choice. Now I list here 2 examples. You'll hear about districts that are cracked or packed. I don't want to get deep into it because we can spend a whole webinar discussing what these terms mean. But I do want to just point to the graphic just to give you sort of a visual of what this looks like. Let's say we're talking about a political district or we're talking about political parties, right? And in this example, you'll see there are 6 districts. There are 30 people in this district. So you assume, great, 5 people in each, it's pretty straightforward, right? Not so easy. As you'll see, though you could have a majority blue district, they were cracked or sort of split in order to ensure that no matter in what district they're placed in, they would not be a majority. This impacts redistricting substantially because that means that no matter where, if you are a blue household, no matter what district you are in, you would never be able to elect a candidate of your choice. Packing is the same concept. It's instead of creating multiple blue districts, let's say as the example on the right demonstrates, you would just create one blue district. So out of 6, you would just have one district that's blue. And so only one district would be able to elect a candidate of their choosing in this example. We also talk about racial gerrymandering. So before I was talking about political, maybe Republicans versus Democrats. However, that's political parties are at play in your particular jurisdiction. So in this example, let's say we have racial minority groups, which is a lot of the work that we at Latino Justice do. And let's say there's 16 people here, only 4 of them identify as a minority group or are part of a cohesive minority group. I can easily say, okay, 4 districts, I'll create just 4 equal districts, 4 people in each. What is there to argue about, right? Easy, again. But we are realizing here that there are minority groups here and that we are splitting or maybe what we call cracking this minority population or subset of the population in a manner which prevents them from again electing someone of their choosing, right? So in the other example, you can see I could have very well created a district where the majority was a minority group in that jurisdiction, but have chosen maybe not to, or maybe it's purposely done. So if the legislature or commissions ignore this racial minority group, they can create a district as demonstrated on the left, where the voice of this minority group is essentially silenced, in that it is unable to elect a candidate of their choice. No matter where you place them, you'll always see there only be 25% of the eligible voter population. And so they'll never be able to make a substantial difference in who gets elected. While we will not get into the discussion about it here, the Voting Rights Act does provide protection for racial and ethnic minorities in situations like this. This is an important point to consider when we talk about redistricting, because our goal as advocates and community organizers is to ensure that when the districts are drawn during this cycle and all the other cycles that will be forthcoming, the Latino population is not grouped in a manner which prevents them from being able to choose a representative. As you have already heard, the Latino population in New York has grown, and thus districts drawn in New York should reflect this population change. So just to reiterate the point, redistricting does not mean gerrymandering, and I kind of have some graphics here to explain. Redistricting, we're speaking about it just voting, the redrawing of voting districts. When we talk about gerrymandering, we're talking about the manipulation of those districts in order to gain some political advantage over another party, over a certain subset of the population. So why is redistricting important? Why are we here? Why do we keep emphasizing this point? I kept saying the same thing over and over again. I think all of the panelists will say it. It's the ability to elect representation of your choosing. Who best represents your interests? Does it make sense that you are in a district that spans, 50 miles and that you have to maybe cross a bridge and I don't know how you can't walk to it, or it's so vast that you are from very different communities? It determines resources allocation. So funding for your local transportation, roads, schools, hospitals. Do you need more schools? Do you need more hospitals in those districts? And the emphasis here is that these electoral districts, while we talk about redistricting and we focus on, going out there and being part of the process, the biggest takeaway from redistricting is that these districts are in place for the next 10 years, right? There's no way to change them absent some court intervention once they're set in place. So the districts that today we create during this redistricting cycle in 2021 will be in place till 2032. Now, if you think about how much your life has changed in 10 years, think about how much districts change in 10 years. And so this is why we emphasize the point of always being involved in this process. Quickly, I will speak about the process in New York and who's responsible. Prior to 2014, redistricting was conducted by LATFR, which, as Frankie mentioned, is a legislative task force on demographic and research and reapportionment. In 2014, there was a constitutional amendment that established the Independent Redistricting Commission. It's a 10-member commission that will be drawing the boundaries for both congressional and state legislative redistricting. It may be a question that comes up, but I just want to clarify: the Independent Redistricting Commission is not responsible for the New York City redistricting or the redistricting of New York City Council seats. That is a separate process, so we will not be discussing that here today because that is not a role of the Independent Redistricting Commission. So how will they complete redistricting? As you'll see here, we just received the census data, what feels like yesterday, but it was about 2 weeks ago. We just received our census data. The commission has also received their census data. They will then use this data to create maps, which will be released somewhere between September 15th and September 30th. They released the first set of maps. After those maps are released, the Independent Redistricting Commission is required to hold public hearings across the state. And so this is a process that we may get into later that we want everyone in this community to get involved in. It will be an opportunity for you to look at those maps and say, hey, that doesn't make sense, or you forgot to consider this community, or you forgot to take into account that that district will, I have to jump puddles and bridges and all that to get to. Once all those comments are taken into account, the Redistricting Commission will then vote on a map that they create, and they will submit this to the legislature by January 1st or as late as January 15th of 2022. The legislature can approve the maps, and we can go back and forth about that process. But ultimately, the Independent Redistricting Commission will have a second opportunity to introduce maps if the first set is rejected by the legislature, and they can do so no later than February 28th. At that point, if they are rejected or the plans are vetoed, the legislature can draw its own maps or amend the second plan. I speak briefly here about what the constitutional redistricting requirements as required by law. I will not get into them, but they're here if you want to look at what type of criteria the Redistricting Commission will look at. These are, this is a quick map of what areas the Independent Redistricting Commission will hold hearings in. There's 12 required hearings that the commission will hold this fall. So ultimately, what does a fair redistricting process look like? We say that a fair redistricting process is one in which the public is able to actively engage at every step of the process. One in which the maps are drawn in a manner which accurately reflects changes in the population. And lastly, it focuses on safeguarding racial minority groups from maps which have the effect of diminishing their ability to elect candidates of their choice. And this is my contact information, and that is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation, Fulvia. A lot of information, and we are going to try to, in the next hour or so, try to just like unpack a little bit of this information. So let's bring it back to our panelists and discuss a little bit more deeper, right? And thank you so much for all of you to give us your time and expertise during this important topic. Let's start with the Assemblyman. As we learned from Fulvia's presentation, this is the first time that an independent redistricting commission will be drawing the districts instead of the state assembly. Can you help us explain a little bit more why was the independent redistricting commission developed? Why is the state investing funding in these independent redistricting commission?
Yeah, I think it came out of a genesis of not just good government groups, but really experience where we saw that this process as it exists was highly politicized. And I think recalling when we did it last time in 2010, we had different parties controlling each chamber of the legislature. So you had Democrats controlling the Assembly and the Republican Party controlling the Senate. And there it was extraordinarily partisan. I think the result, you could argue, were highly gerrymandered districts on the state Senate side, and really no way to move forward in terms of addressing some of the issues that Fulvia brought out in terms of cracking and packing. And I think even when we came to the congressional conversation, it had to go to the courts to redraw a number of districts because there really ended up becoming this partisan stalemate. What we've seen also in other states is that where you have one party control, you have voices that are removed from the process through gerrymandered districts as well. So I think the conversation and the movement across legislatures nationally had been to try and put in place an independent commission. Something that looks like it's not controlled by one particular party, something that could be presented that provided real public discourse and conversation around what representation should look like, around what census changes had been occurring, and something more robust than what was previously in place in terms of the LAT4 process, which was a legislature-led process. And even if we have the best intentions about providing hearings, certainly it was not in the age of Zoom in the same way 10 years ago, and a lot of people's voices weren't counted and weren't heard. So I think the genesis of that is, looking at best practices as it was occurring in other states to bring in a higher level of independence, a higher level of communication. I think the requirements around the number of hearings was not accidental. It was to make sure we went to every part of the state and created a vehicle for people and a requirement for them to participate. So I think, fast forwarding to this moment now, you might design the best system, but you don't get to try it out until years later, right? 2014 to 2020, 2021. Here we are, and now, and as you mentioned in your opening, a lot happened during that census project process, including a delay in the receipt of the data that we're getting right now. So I think we're at that pivotal moment where we all are recognizing that there's a short amount of time frame to get the work that needs to be done, and I think we're working really hard to see if we can get there.
It's interesting as you mentioned that all this process started, and then we needed to wait until this moment. It's like there has been a lot of wait and a lot of expectation, and with that in mind, I would like to go now with Jennifer. And it has mentioned that the constitutional amendment was approved in 2014, and part of the argument that the Assemblyman mentioned was to create an independent commission that will oversee redistricting, that will help more people of color, women, and other groups that have not been historically represented. Jennifer, can you expand a little bit more on that point?
When we talk about the census, a lot of the information that came out was about the need to be counted for funding for schools, funding for hospitals, federal funding that we were due to receive based on our population. And redistricting is kind of essentially the same argument. And I think Fulvia laid this out excellently, where instead of the funding coming from the federal government, it's your elected representative fighting for that funding whether it's schools or whether it's your roads, your public transit, your parks, your libraries. It could even be about your garbage pickup. Your elected representative makes decisions on the daily that impact you and your family and your community's lives every single day. Whether we're going to fix the road or get a new library or add a new park, these are the things that your elected representative is making decisions about. And so it's so important that we have this new process where people have a really clear mechanism of how they can participate. So that way they can let their community's needs be known to the commission. So as the commission is drawing these lines, they can reflect back and say, hey, these particular communities of interest said that these are the problems in their community. We're essentially filling in the gaps of the census because the census doesn't know about your local park. The census doesn't know about your school or that you don't have good books or enough chairs in your school. It doesn't know those things. So that's where people really need to participate and where the Independent Redistricting Commission needs to hear from the people about these issues.
I love that connection, Jennifer, basically saying that the census doesn't know if you need more books in that school. It's a process, but now it is time to just make sense of these numbers and actually get to work. And with that in mind, Professor Wise, it was mentioned earlier that New York State lost a congressional seat or will lose a congressional seat because of the 2020 census. And apparently it's a downward trend for New York's representation in Congress that have been going on for the last 50 years. But this is a little bit confusing because it's like, is New York has not been losing population, or are we losing population? How is it possible? Why are we losing these seats?
Well, it's a great question and something really worth thinking about and looking to not let this happen again in the future. Yeah, the congressional districts are apportioned according to a federal formula. Every state gets one district, and the remaining districts, 51 to 435, are assigned to the states based on their state populations. We learned that New York lost its 27th district because about one subway car's worth of people hadn't been counted. And Minnesota kept a district by counting about 26 extra people itself. So the numbers are very, very tight, and we've never in history seen the numbers, at least not since the current formula was put in place 70 years ago, come down to these tight numbers. New York in 1945, just a few generations ago, had 45 members of Congress. Now we're down to 27. That's the same number New York had during the 1820s. So we've gone from 27 members in 1820 to 45 members in 1940, now down to 26 members in 2022. But yet the state actually grew, much to our surprise a bit, from 2010 to 2020. New York grew by about 800,000 people, or 4.2% since 2010. The problem is that other states grew at a greater rate than New York did. New York grew at 4.2%. The national average was about 7%. But the good news is that having lost 5 districts in 1980, 3 districts after 1990, and 2 districts each after 2000 and 2010, New York only lost 1 district. Now, with the population growing, and be mindful that the white population for the first time in history is decreasing, while the Hispanic and the Asian populations are increasing. The Hispanic population in New York increased by 15%, more new Hispanic residents than any other racial or ethnic category of all the different categories the Census Bureau counts. So the good news we have to look for is that New York doesn't lose any districts after 2030, and that we are, I hate to say fortunate to have only lost 1 district, because the loss of every district hurts. New York in the last Congress had the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, the chair of the House Oversight and Reform Committee, the Judiciary Committee. And every time you lose a congressional district, you lose a vote, you lose power. So that's not good, but we're on the right path now, that with increased immigration with the doors opening up again under the new White House administration, New York has a bright future. And we're also very fortunate that the city of New York and the counties and cities across the state were very helpful in identifying missing housing address units that the Census Bureau uses to send out the questionnaires to. It's unbelievable to think that New York City's planning department found 260,000 addresses that the Census Bureau didn't have. Now, we always knew that there was an undercount in previous decades of probably 250,000 people, yet a few years ago, the New York City officials found over 250,000 house addresses that the Census Bureau never sent forms to. And that counts, I think, for part of the huge increase of 600,000 people, more than 600,000 people that New York City's population alone increased by.
It is incredible to hear all of these numbers. And while the future looks bright, the moment is now to make sure that we have a redistricting process that will benefit everybody. And as Jennifer also mentioned before, that also help elect more process that can help more people of color and women. And talking about that, I want to bring Emily Paez to talk about how redistricting can affect Latinos specifically. Emily.
Sure. Well, Frankie, I think when, in terms of us being able to look at the most recent census data trends, we can quickly see that the future in some ways is Latino. In fact, roughly 1 out of every 5 New Yorker is identified and is reflective of a Latino. Our population has grown by over 15% in the recent 10 years based on the US Census Bureau information that is currently available. And also highlighting that this is based on those who have completed the census based on all the misinformation around participation that we worked on. And that should really tell us enough about the effect that redistricting has on our community. The process of redistricting includes the how and where districts are drawn, can really make the difference between having, as Jennifer alluded to, and also Fulvia, having the ability to elect leaders and policymakers who are aware of the needs of their community, or having to constantly explain these issues to elected officials and who really don't understand the community. And Frankie, you also alluded to earlier in the conversation that redistricting affects the daily activities of Latinos. So it's very simple in terms of diluting this information. We understand that the redistricting process is a heavy conversation mixed with numbers, mixed with data, mixed with procedures and process and stakeholders. But redistricting essentially at its core leads to representation. That representation leads to policy changes. Those policy changes will impact our overall quality of life. While there are so many issues that affect Latinos, as we are a non-monolithic group and a blend of so many different cultures, one thing is definitely certain. We are not a one issue based constituency. And in just highlighting a few examples of the reasons why Latinos need to be involved in the redistricting process, we can dig into the examples that I'm going to mention. Again, just a very few of the many. Considering the COVID-19 recovery, right? Latinos were heavily impacted and disproportionately impacted in COVID-19. We saw that in the death rates and in our ability to just overall get back on our feet and get back on track. So making sure that we are able to elect leaders that are vigilant and aware of those, those numbers and the disproportion that we have been affected with really impacts the political representation on all levels of government. Knowing that COVID is still one of the largest issues that is affecting our communities. And we just need to make sure that leaders are being held accountable and that we have the ability through the redistricting process to elect leaders and policymakers at a state and local level as well. Another example that is oftentimes maybe overlooked just mixed with the jargon. It's a little bit more local when we think about land use and resources. Just recently, in speaking to my colleague Frederick and others, the New York Times reported and published an article that showed that the East Harlem Street were 31 degrees hotter than Central Park West. And you probably imagine, okay, what does that matter and how does that affect our community, right? And most of that is actually really due to these communities having lower count and lower numbers of trees, particularly in lower income neighborhoods. So the article mentioned that just by the map, just by you counting the trees within the map of a specific district, you can simply see the inequalities in those communities. And you can think about, so why is this impacting? How does this tie into redistricting? Well, when researchers went back and they found out that these neighborhoods that didn't have as many designated trees were too risky for home loans by the federal government. And this dates back to these red lines that were created and drawn back in the 1930s. And Black and brown neighborhoods are still paying for the consequences of like higher temperatures that ultimately could lead to higher air pollution levels and other health concerns that are already vigilant in our Latino community. Again, these are just a small examples from, a much larger issue with COVID, and then a much more local issue with just resources. But, our panel has also alluded to education system, our ability to just kind of get back on track with issues that are affecting us locally. So despite the importance, unfortunately, that redistricting has in our community and it affecting millions of Latinos in the state, it's really not an issue that is top of mind in our community. So, it's really important for organizers, leaders in our community to really pull in our community, to educate them, to keep them involved, and to keep them active and understand and break down this information in a way that's digestible so that they can also understand that they too can insert themselves into the process. Communicating directly with grassroots leaders is critically important, especially since they are oftentimes trusted messengers in those communities.
It is incredibly important to understand all of these examples and how it is affecting, this process could affect or will affect our communities. So thank you, Emily, for that. I want to go back to Fulvia and talk a little bit more about something that had been mentioned, and is like, representation can be diluted. How exactly this works? How is this political representation of communities and minority dilution works?
Yes. Thank you, Frankie, for the question. So you'll hear oftentimes, and many of us on this call have discussed this principle of one person, one vote, right? We live in a representative democracy, meaning that we, elect our officials, part of these electoral districts. And so the idea is that every vote, every person and their vote has equal weight, right? Pretty straightforward. I get to vote for one person, you get to vote for one person. It should just work seamlessly. And that only occurs when governments draw districts with equal populations so that, every resident in that district has equal access to government, no matter where they live or no matter where their district is in the state. Now, what occurs, and New York is a great example of that, is that when districts start varying in the terms in population size, for example, the weight of each vote starts to differ. In underpopulated districts, that vote is worth so much more. And in overpopulated districts, that vote is worth less. So we look at New York City, for example. A huge portion of the Latino population lives in the 5 boroughs, right? And oftentimes it's argued that we have overpopulated districts in New York City. When you look at the when you look at the population size of some of the New York City districts compared to the upstate districts, you see there are substantial differences in size. Now, some deviations are allowed, but then you start to think, how do these deviations start to impact the weight of those votes? So in my presentation, I also mentioned it's the way we also group the Latino population, let's say, into these districts, right? How are we grouping them? Are we grouping them in a way that their vote and within that electoral district has no power. It's not a majority. It's not going to make a substantive difference when we talk about who they get to elect, right? If the Latino population in District 1, which I'm not referring to the exact district, but in New York, could ideally have been 60% of the population based on census data, they could have elected someone of their choosing. But maybe the district was drawn in a way that ensured they were only going to be 40% of that district. So no matter how they vote, if they voted collectively as a voice, and Emily alluded, we're not a monolithic group. Sometimes we vary in our issues and our positions on those issues. But let's say they did vote. No matter if they all went out to the ballot, no matter we rallied everyone, picked them up, brought them to the booth, there was going to be no way in that district for Latinos to elect someone of their choosing. Whoever that 60% majority would always, no matter how how much advocacy we do as organizations, how much we encourage voter registration, there would be nothing we could do to change the power of that vote. And we couldn't do it for 10 years, right? And so those are the problems that we see when we talk about one person, one vote, and what some of the minority vote dilution looks like in places like New York.
So definitely, two of the other important concepts that we have been talking here about transparency and bipartisanship are key. And I would like to invite Jeffrey to talk a little bit more about why we need to ensure that redistricting and the reapportionment process is both transparent and bipartisan. And can we accomplish this?
Well, that is something we're going to be finding out this year. As has been mentioned earlier, the New York legislature had been under divided control for the last 4 redistricting cycles. And for the first time, Democrats now control both the Assembly and the Senate, but also for the first time, we have an independent commission drawing the first set of lines for the legislature to later consider. So the commission has been holding outreach hearings. They completed a series of about a dozen hearings over July and August. And the commission itself is balanced with 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 2 unaffiliated members, one of whom we'll hear from shortly. So their challenge ahead of them is to develop new lines that reflect the bipartisan balance from where they were all appointed. So that's what we have to see how the commission plays out. The commission has been focusing on so-called communities of interest, asking people where they live, who they live with, and how the districts ought to reflect communities instead of the way the districts have been shaped in the past. The commission also has to work with several different criteria, rules, so to speak, including looking at the cores of current districts, not pairing incumbents against each other from opposite parties or neighboring districts, of following jurisdictional boundaries, of drawing districts that are shaped in a compact way, that they're drawn where you can go from part A to part B of a district, not have to leave it. So the commission now has to look at all the different kinds of comments that it received throughout the state, and each of the hearings went for a long time. They heard from a lot of people, so there's a good hearing record. And these 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats and 2 independent members of either of the 2 major parties have to sit down and work out a plan that will hopefully see September 15th or shortly afterwards. But what we're not going to see are plans drawn by the commission that were drawn as in past years by the Assembly for the Assembly or the Senate for the Senate. This is a new process. And we have a new process because the voters approved a new method after years of having the elected officials pick their voters. 2014, a measure was put on the state constitutional, a ballot question amending the Constitution, looking to see how the people can pick their districts the other way around. So we have a lot to see in the next month or so.
Well, we can say that everybody is looking forward to this process to be transparent. We are excited about the independent commission, but going to the assemblyman, does that mean that the commission is going to control the entire process? Do you guys give up too much control? The state legislature and the governor are still involved according to the presentation that we saw, but how exactly is and how powerful is the commission versus you guys?
Yeah, I think they're extraordinarily powerful at this point in the process. They really are the point at which all information regarding communities are supposed to be reflected, right? This is where it was supposed to be a better system with a better design. And I think, even just looking at the chats, and I saw one of the comments about the growth of the Dominican population in Highbridge and the West Bronx. There are trends like that and communities like that are just not going to be known unless there's testimony, unless people come forward and say, we have a large Orthodox population, we have a large Latino population, and the numbers will tell some of the story. They'll certainly show, where a place like East Harlem has 43%, Latinos and what changes have happened, but they won't get into additional detail. And sometimes we have to see where that growth is happening. So I think, that's an important part of the process. But where we get involved is after, I guess, our the check and balance on really giving up a lot of this power and control and not being able to do that independently is to approve the process and have a mechanism where if we feel like there's, some things that were not taken into consideration, we can reject the plan and get another opportunity for the Independent Redistricting Commission to amend their plan and submit it again. So I think that's, an important check and balance for us to make sure that, in a process that is, hands off, literally and figuratively from the legislatures, and that we're able to still say, okay, but you might have missed, this dynamic that's happening in this part of the state or in this part of Brooklyn or in this part of Manhattan, where different things have happened over the last 10 years that will change the way representation happens. I think one example is when you look at a place like Lower Manhattan and the West Side and the Hudson Yards, where the growth there has been phenomenal. And how has the numbers changed in terms of the way those groups should be aggregated and who they're reflecting and representation. So I think that's going to be one of the things that we'll be looking for in these plans. But really, we're all looking. I think we're all respectful of the process. I mean, we are very deliberate about not taking any actions that would undermine the level of participation that's happening in the Independent Redistricting Commission, and on the contrary, promoting it. I mean, for us as Latinos and for us as elected officials, it's important for us to encourage our groups to be part of this process, to go out there, submit testimony. If you don't do it in person or on Zoom, submit it in a written form, but in some way, shape, or form, make sure that what is happening uniquely in your community comes in there so that it is on the record, so that it can be taken into account by the Independent Redistricting Commission. And that way we have the best possible product when we have to vote on this in January. And I think that doesn't happen by itself. It really requires the public input and disclosure around that. One of the responsibilities that we have as a commission and this demographic research is making sure that those folks who are in the correction system get reflected in the right place, not where they're currently serving their sentence or their time, but where they lived before they entered into that system. So that's something we're working on. That's something that had to happen legislatively. That's something that happened because of the advocacy of the folks who participate, including Latino Justice and NAACP, to make sure that our numbers really reflect the communities and the resources that are required both for reentry and when they and for before they enter into the system. So that's an important part of the process that we still participate in. We've got to get those numbers out as quickly as possible so that the Independent Redistricting Commission can take additional action on that. And then after that, we are all watching like everyone else and making sure that the process works and people are incorporating it until we have to act again in January.
It is clear that we need to get involved. You have mentioned getting involved several times. And now I'm going to go to Jennifer. I said, like, Jennifer, what can we start doing now if it is an individual or some of the organizations that are listening to this webinar today? How do we start getting involved?
Yeah, I think all of the groups on this webinar are involved in trying to get people prepared to testify. The League has a resource, nyredistricting.org, where we have basically a clearinghouse of information, learning about your community of interest, learning about how to map your community, learning about all the things we talked about. Why does this even matter? Why does my community need to be represented? And making sure that people are ready. As Fulvia mentioned, we have the first set of hearings in July and August. The maps are going to be coming out very soon. It's very exciting. And then we're going to have a second set of hearings where anybody listening to this webinar can request to participate and make sure that they let their community of interest be heard, basically, by the commission so that they can know what your community of interest really looks like and about these really specific pieces of data that aren't necessarily captured by the census.
And for Emily, specifically about the Latino community, what we need to do as Latinos and Latinos that live in the state of New York and in the city, what exactly you want them to do?
Awesome. Well, I definitely echo Jennifer's point, and the way we have framed it is like sometimes, we want to kind of simplify. It's like, so think of four different things that we can do within the Latino community as key steps to helping us be involved and to helping our community get organized. The first one is community education and engagement, learning about the redistricting process. Yes, this is a step into understanding what the basics are, but pulling others that are in our spaces and that are also equally leaders and are working with a different group of people that they have different touch points, making sure to engage them and educate them also in the process. Two is staying informed, right? Keeping ourselves and again, those around us informed about the process, signing up for the latest information on the redistricting process with the key stakeholders like the Independent Redistricting Commission, which right now, as mentioned, is the organization that we need to really advocate for and have them, showcase to them and have them understand the ramifications in the community and how those things are affecting us. So signing up for their latest information, going onto their YouTube page right now, Jeff Wise and others have mentioned that they've already had public hearings when they were doing a listening tour, right? And getting a pulse of what the community's needs were. So you can go ahead, access those things. They're readily available and accessible to you. So checking those things out, again, staying informed, signing up to other listservs or organizations that are working on the redistricting process, like the League of Women Voters, like Latino Justice, like NALEO, Hispanic Federation, and others that are having these conversations. And it's very important to keep yourselves in the loop of those organizations as well. Organize. Work collectively in coalitions, work collectively. I think it's just always so much more important for us. We can be sitting here crying on our own, but then we can, or we can sitting here advocating on something on our own and probably feel like we're not being heard and we're screaming at the top of our lungs. Meanwhile, if we organize ourselves and work with like-minded groups and form coalitions, we have a much larger voice. We can then make a much larger kind of ask to those that are in areas and in positions of power or positions of policy where they can influence these changes. And then, obviously organizing in terms of also going to the media when it's needed, shedding light to certain problems, right? Using that as an instrumental tool with intention and with purpose, not just always, and that's the third one. And the last one It's just get involved, as again was just mentioned, testify, write to the Independent Redistricting Commission, share your findings and voice your concerns. So those are the key 4 steps.
And I think, Emily, that in order for us to continue this conversation, and this is going to be the program that you are going to be leading, just talk to us very quickly about the Redistricting Academy that we're going to launch.
Absolutely. I actually am very excited. I'm a little biased, of course, because it's our academy, but in terms of me just being a listener and me being a student in this academy, I am very excited about it, because although I wasn't probably as instrumental in the last redistricting process, I've learned so much and I've grown. And so, Frankie, I really am super excited to announce that in mid-September, Hispanic Federation is launching the Redistricting Academy. And this academy will consist of a series of bilingual online trainings that will take this entire conversation that we're having, but really hone in onto the granular details that this process unfolds, really. And so getting involved in the process and what it looks like specifically to your state. This is going to be a national academy in many different states. So the participants who complete the Redistricting Academy will relate to local coalition partners, learn how to draw maps, gain knowledge about how to effectively advocate for a fair and accurate map to the appropriate stakeholders. The Academy will run from mid-September to December and include specific states sessions in New York, in Connecticut, in Pennsylvania, in Florida, and Georgia. So everyone who's RSVP'd to this event will receive the details and the information. And I believe as of today, we actually have the registration link live. So I believe one of my colleagues is going to put that on the chat for us to share with you all. And again, we will be sharing this information with everyone who has RSVP'd to this event. As I mentioned, Frankie, earlier, I'm really not just saying it in this space. I really am personally excited about the Academy, and I'm really looking forward to gaining more information, digging a little deeper into the data, understanding the free tools and resources on even redistricting that are available to our community. And so I welcome you all to join us and to participate in that Academy.
Thank you, Emily. And for those who are interested in the link, is going to be found at hispanicfederation.org/redistricting academy. And before we open up for Q&A from the public, I want to give Commissioner Ibelis Cuevas Molina an opportunity to talk to us. Commissioner, thank you for joining us today. It is really great to see the Latina Commissioner of this commission to be part of this event. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Hola a todos. Hola a mi gente de la comunidad latina e hispana del estado de Nueva York. Quiero agradecer a Hispanic Federation, Latino Justice, and NALEO por este excelente evento de educación y movilización para participar en el importante proceso de rediseño de nuestros distritos estatales legislativos y congresionales. Es mi esperanza, como comisionada de la Comisión Independiente, que haya una gran participación de parte de cada comunidad latina e hispana del estado de Nueva York en el proceso de comentario y vistas públicas de la comisión, especialmente luego de que presentemos al público nuestros borradores de los mapas de nuestros distritos legislativos y congresionales en el mes de septiembre. Ustedes tienen el poder ahora mismo, en este momento, de someter mapas y descripciones de sus comunidades de interés en la página web de la comisión, www.nyirc.gov. Y adicionalmente pueden participar en las vistas públicas que comenzarán aproximadamente un mes después de que los borradores de la comisión se hagan públicos. Necesitamos escuchar sus voces en este proceso para así poder proteger su derecho al voto y su derecho a tener representación en nuestra democracia. Hello, everyone. Changing to English now. Hi to all of my people in the Latino and Hispanic communities in the state of New York. I want to thank all of the organizations that put together this excellent education and mobilization event to encourage participation in the critically important redrawing process of our state legislative and congressional district lines. It is my hope as a member of the Independent Redistricting Commission that there will be a great level of participation on behalf of every Latino, Hispanic community across the state of New York in the public comment and public hearing process of the commission, especially after we make public our draft maps in September. You all have the power right now to submit maps and descriptions of your communities of interest on the commission's website, www.nyirc.gov. Furthermore, you can speak directly to us, the commissioners, in the public hearing process. These are constitutionally required public hearings. There's going to be 12 constitutionally required hearings, but we're going to add 2 or 3 more just to make sure that we get everyone into the public hearing process. We need to hear your voices in the process in order to best protect your voting rights and your right to representation in our democracy. We cannot do this without you, and I look forward to seeing you across the state and hearing you in all of these public hearings.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for your time and for being here with us. And I hope that this discussion is also helping you thinking about some of the things that we need to look after during this process. I'm going to go very quickly to a couple of questions. We have time for a couple of questions. And I want to go to the question that the Assemblyman mentioned before from Omar Suarez. And he says, and this question is for anybody who wants to jump in. Since 2000, there has been a huge growth in the Dominican community in the High Bridge neighborhood and the surrounding areas of West Bronx, and yet these communities have tended not to be district with surrounding communities with large Dominican population, despite many obvious connections between communities. I believe this is the case in the New York State Senate, Assembly, and City Council. Is this something that can be addressed in this redistricting process? And this question is for anyone.
I'll just mention that the Dominican population really began growing 30 some odd years ago in Manhattan. And one thing we've seen with the population data from the Census Bureau is the shift from Upper Manhattan towards the Bronx, where there's been much greater growth. We also saw with the census data that was released 2 weeks ago that the population in that Dominican focused district in Upper Manhattan has lost a lot of population. So we'll see how the commission deals with that dynamic.
I think that we're losing Jeffrey. Jeffrey, we're getting you in and out. Sorry.
The Dominican community, which has been significantly increased and reflected in data. So let's see. Okay. Yeah, well, let me pause for a minute because my connection may be unstable.
Okay.
Am I coming in any better now?
Yeah, you're coming in better now.
But I think just to add to that, Jeffrey, and I think Flavia can jump in, the unity map is tremendously important, I think, in terms of helping us to think about and figure out how those changes are going to be accurately reflected. And I think, you know, we highlighted 2 of the biggest growing populations, the Asian community and the Latino community, and both, you know, have lived, side by side in many different areas, but arguably, the Asian voice has been underrepresented in certain ways. So, I think what we're going to be looking at is how have those changes occurred, particularly in places like parts of the West Bronx, parts of, East Harlem, Upper Manhattan, parts of Queens, and Southeast Queens. What are the changes there, and how do we make sure that they accurately reflect the communities of interest and minority groups like us? And I think one of the things that we do is engaging in this dialogue to get there, because the census data may just say Latino, and we might not be understanding that underneath Latino is a large Dominican population versus a Puerto Rican population. And with Asian group, it's even Southeast Asian versus, a Chinese population are very different in terms of needs and the reflection of the community. So I think that's where, these kinds of conversations and the work of Latino Justice and the Unity Coalition make all the difference, and we're all eagerly anticipating their release.
Thank you so much. I have another question. I think that maybe Assemblyman, you can actually tell us. It's like we keep hearing about hearings, and people are asking, it's like, what are you looking for when someone provides testimony, or Jennifer, you guys are excellent at this also. What are the tips that you can give? But let's start with the Assemblyman. It's just like, what are you guys looking for in a testimony? Is it something that people should feel intimidated by?
I don't think so. I think the first step is really taking a look at what the map reflects now. That be familiar with your assembly district, your Senate district, and your congressional district. And then, I think just by talking to your neighbors, you can figure out whether or not you feel like you're accurately being reflected, in those conversations. I'll give a personal example. Our Senate district, I represent East Harlem. I have 2 senators, one who's, represents part of East Harlem, and then part of the West Side, and then I have the other half of my district is represented with East Harlem, with parts of Roosevelt Island and parts of the Bronx. So we certainly don't think that our voice is very well represented in that particular Senate district. And I think those are the things, and those are the things that you talk about with your neighbors, especially when it comes voting time. But you can also say, well, I don't think that we're getting the representation that we need. And this happens across every single community. Once you start that conversation about, hey, have you seen your elected official? Which one is it? Do you know who represents us today? And in particular, when we talk about congressional seats, which are also very large, and we do have multi-borough congressional seats. Those are the ones that I think, you raise the biggest ideas of, are we reflected, are our voices reflected, are our issues reflected in our dialogues with them? So I think when you're submitting testimony, I think you start from the context of what you know about your district, and then incorporate who your community is today, and what are the issues of importance to you. Are there continuities or similarities in different groups? Is it religion that makes your community what it is? Is it ethnicity? Is it a combination thereof? Or is it particularly diverse in some ways, but not in other ways? And I think that's the kind of testimony that you're not going to get from a number on a page that just says Latino, or just says Asian, or just says demographic income level, right? So you don't get that unless people put life into the testimony. So I would say, share your community in your testimony.
Thank you. And Jennifer, from your perspective as an organization so important and that do this often, what would be the best tip for anybody that is listening to this and say, like, I don't know how to go about this?
Yeah, Asomar Rodriguez really laid it out well. You're basically telling a story. So your community of interest are the characters. You want to kind of tell the story of the community. But as far as top tips for this, we have a number of resources on our website, the sort of quick and easy way to write a testimony. But I would say for this, being specific is crucial. Specifically stating what your district numbers are really helps the commission visualize where your district is. And saying on the visualization piece, if you can provide an image of a map, that is so helpful because maybe one commissioner is familiar with your neighborhood, but the other 9 might not be. They might have never been to your neighborhood before ever. So providing them with a map and almost like circling, this is my neighborhood, this is the community I'm talking about, is so, so helpful. And for the actual oral testimonies, you can share a map on the screen. So if we're doing the second round via Zoom, you can literally show them as you're testifying, here is my Senate district right here, Senate District 5, and this is my neighborhood, and then here's the story of this district. So definitely check out our website because we have a really great resource on that. So yeah.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. And with that, we're going to close this event today. Thank you to all my amazing panelists and for the presentation and all the resources that you have been sharing. And also I want to thank Naleo Educational Fund, Latino Justice Pro Desk for co-hosting this event with us. If this is information that was helpful, please share this video on your organization's social media and with others. And remember that if you want to get more involved in the redistricting process and learn more on how to draw and design the maps you want to advocate for, please sign up right away to the Redistricting Academy at hispanicfederation.org/Redistricting Academy. The link has been added to the chat. Thank you for joining us this evening. Muchísimas gracias. Buenas noches. Have a great night.
Gracias.